You're listening to the Converging Paths podcast, brought to you by Barakat Trust, with the support of the Altair Trust and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture.
Welcome everyone, this is Saifa Rashidi from the Barakat Trust. Welcome to this episode of the Converging Paths podcast. And today we're very happy to be hosting in conversation Professor Anna Leone from the Department of Archaeology at Durham University. Welcome, Anna.
Good morning.
Well, Anna, the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what fueled your interest in North African archaeology? And tell us about what you set out to explore in your early work.
So my discovery of North Africa archaeologically was in fact by pure chance, because when I was studying at the university, my professor started a new project in Carthage. And his plan was to create an interactive map of all the excavations done in Carthage during the colonial period. Carthage was a very desirable residence for rich French who were going on holiday during the French colonial period. So there was an intense building activity, end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century. And so when they were building these new rich villas for holidays, they were partially destroying archaeological remains, but also partially excavating them and recording them. So the idea was to map them all and try to make sense of what Carthage looked like and what was the history of Carthage. I should say that Carthage, although it's a very famous site, is archaeologically very disappointing, exactly because of this colonial intervention that operated a massive destruction of the archaeological remains. So my work was basically to go through all the archives and map the location of the excavation. And chronologically, the focus of my work was from the 3rd and 4th century, so from the period in which Christianity started to spread across the Roman Empire into the Byzantine period, which was the Christian Empire, and then the early Islamic period. And so my focus was on seeing the transition from the pagan world into Christianity and from the Christian world into the Islamic world, and how they impacted on the transformation of the city. And this really passionated me. And so I transferred this work into my PhD, and I expanded it beyond just the site of Carthage to the whole of North Africa. So in particular to Libya, the west of Libya, modern Tripolitania, and Tunisia. And so I worked on the archive of the French colonial period and the Italian colonial period, and tried to make sense of the excavation, because a major problem of working on these periods is that the attention at the time was primarily on objects and mosaics. They were looking for marbles, they were looking for statues, inscriptions, and everything that was later or not particularly monumental was destroyed and removed with little recording. So my aim was, by going through all of the excavation and collecting all the little details about the later period of occupation, to try to make sense on how these cities across Tunisia and Libya transformed with the Christianization and with the advent of Islam.
Thanks, that's so interesting. And I wondered if you could tell me, like in 2 words, why Carthage in Tunisia was so important, and secondly, what were these transformations that you observed through your work?
So Carthage was very important because, of course, in the Republican Roman period, Carthage faced Rome with the Punic Wars that ended with the complete destruction of Carthage. First of all, Carthage is a foundation by Phoenicians coming from the east, from Lebanon, and they moved to the coast of North Africa and they founded Carthage. And Carthage grew and became a very important city. And in this progress of becoming powerful, also threatened Rome. And so they had 3 wars, the 3 Punic Wars that ended in 146 BC. And the final phase of this war saw the complete destruction by the Romans of the city of Carthage. They kind of just raided it, put it on fire. And then Augustus, with the creation of the Roman Empire in 27 BC, refounded the city of Carthage as a Roman city on top of the Punic one. And the new Roman city is a typical Roman city with a regular pattern. The center of the city has a forum with all the Capitoli atrium and the basilica and all the elements that you would normally find in a Roman forum. And so it's a very typical Roman city and continued to be a very important city because then it was the capital of Africa Proconsularis, which was one of the most important and richest provinces of the Roman Empire, and then it continued to be the place where the most important bishop of North Africa was located with the Christianization, and then the center of the Byzantine Empire. So maintained a very strong, powerful position throughout the history of North Africa until the Islamic conquest, when the city of Tunis was founded, which is not far from Carthage, and then progressively Carthage started to lose importance.
Thanks. So how did cities change with the advent of Christianity and then with the advent of Islam?
So first of all, I should say that the advent of Christianity and the advent of Islam were not responsible for the transformation of the cities. The cities transformed because of a substantial change that occurred in the way in which the Roman Empire and the provinces were managed. So progressively in the 3rd and 4th century, the emperors started to acquire more control of funds, money coming from taxes, and they were deciding how to distribute this money among cities, while before this was controlled by local governors. Now everything was managed by the emperor and the imperial administration. So local cities were less independent in trying to maintain their monumentality or build new construction. And so progressively, these cities were really monumental in their appearance, started to find it difficult to maintain and restore these buildings. And we see early decadence of these buildings already in the 4th century. The reason is also because in the imperial period, the local elite was very much willing to pay for public buildings, to have their name in inscriptions, to be there forever, remembered forever. And also, this was the way of showing off their social status in the Roman Empire. But in late antiquity, with this management of funds and budget more controlled by the emperor, there were also restrictions in the way in which people could display their name in the process of restoring buildings or intervening on buildings. So it wasn't convenient anymore. Also in the early imperial period, providing money for the construction of monuments within the city was providing also the opportunity to have cuts in taxes, while in late antiquity this wasn't the case anymore. So overall it was a lot less convenient to pay for public buildings. We can see this problem of maintaining public buildings was very common across the empire because there are many laws by the emperors that are addressing cities and making clear that it is really important and essential for cities to maintain their public monuments in a good state. But archaeologically, we can see that this is not the case. In this process of transformation of public spaces and abandonment of some buildings, like for instance, many forums already were abandoned at the end of the 4th century in North Africa. Also Christianity appears, and of course Christianity with Constantine in AD 313 with the Edict of Milan becomes a religion which is accepted by the empire. And later on, all the pagan temples must be closed. And now you can imagine how many temples there are in every Roman city. And so you had all these empty shells across the empire that could suddenly become either sources of marble or spaces for being reused for other construction. So you have a substantial change in the way in which the public monuments are preserved and are seen by the inhabitants of the city. And so you see the appearance of the construction of the churches. But at the end of the 6th century, it's very obvious that the government is struggling to control these cities and to control, for instance, public spaces. And we see that spaces that before were public are progressively occupied by private people. We see workshops developing, for instance, one of the main temples in the Forum, we see an olive press placed. So we see substantially a transformation in the organization of the city occurring already from the end of the 6th century. And the early Islamic cities are basically equal to the cities in the end of the 6th century. So there is no evidence of a substantial change, at least for 100 years or 200 years, when then they start creating new centers. And I should say also something about the end of Christianity, because the majority of these churches in North Africa were excavated during the colonial period by missionaries, the Père Blanc, who were sent to North Africa. And they always assumed that all the churches were abandoned after the Arab conquest, but there is no evidence. And in fact, at the end of Christianity is well attested in North Africa still in the 11th century, in the 12th century.
So basically, it's an urban transformation related to governance, etc. And you mentioned the commercialization of public buildings and public spaces, and specifically olives. And I wonder if you could tell us about olives and the olive industry and the whole economy.
Well, North Africa was the major producer of olive oil from already the pre-Roman period. North Africans were very, very advanced in the way in which they were exploiting the landscape. And basically, the idea of North African cultivation was to have an extensive approach to cultivation. So they had very large estates cultivated with one crop, because this would require a lot less work and was allowing the production of large quantities of foods. And olive oil was the primary product of North Africa. And we know that during the Roman period, they had to pay the very high quantity of olive oil in taxes to the city of Rome. And this was such a burden for these North African cities that more than once we have revolts against the Roman government. And therefore, this was an element that was always problematic for the economy of North Africa, although North Africa was extremely rich and was producing olive oil from one side and a very famous type of pottery, which is the African Redslip pottery, which is kind of a table vessel that was used in the Roman period, is red in color. They were trading large quantities of olive oil and this pottery, because every time they were sending taxes to Rome, they were also putting in these vessels in the cargoes so they could be sold all over the Roman Empire. And this pottery was of great quality and required all over the Mediterranean. So olive oil basically was the driven element for all of the economy of North Africa.
So does this production of olive oil continue? Can you tell us a bit about the later history of olive cultivation and olive exports?
Well, in 439, North Africa was conquered by the Vandals, who were Germanic population coming from north of Europe who came to Spain, and they were sort of cut off by the fiscal system of the Roman Empire. And so they stopped paying this very high taxation in olive oil to Rome. And we know very little about the Vandals. The Vandal kings ruled North Africa for about 100 years before North Africa was conquered again by the Byzantine Empire. And we know very little about the way in which the Vandals managed the taxation system of North Africa. But what we can see archaeologically is that with the Vandal conquest and the cutting off from the heavy fiscal system of Rome, really North Africa exploded in its economy, and olive oil started to be traded in large quantities, this time to be sold. Also, the African pottery developed as production. We see pottery kilns developing across the whole of North Africa. I'm also studying in excavations in Syria on the Euphrates, and there in the 6th and 7th century have a very large quantity of African Redslip pottery coming from North Africa. So olive oil continued into the Vandal period, continued into the Byzantine period, but already in the 3rd and 4th century, prior to the Vandal conquest, the organization of this olive oil production started to change, because the countryside of North Africa, especially in the south, in Libya, started to be very dangerous, because in Libya there are lots of local tribes who were nomadic. And in late antiquity, probably because of their exchange with the Romans, they started to become sedentary. And we see the settlements appearing in the landscape. But they also, we know from sources, they were really threatening the countryside of Tripolitania. They were sacking cities, destroying settlements, destroying crops. So we see a progressive fortification of the landscape already in the 3rd and 4th century. Although the olive oil production continues, we see the creation of fortified farms appearing in the landscape, which are controlling this olive oil production. We certainly know that the danger was very strong, because we know, for instance, that the bishops from Tripolitania could not go to Carthage to attend the councils because the countryside was extremely insecure and they couldn't travel. And this olive oil production continues also after the Arab conquest. And we see a substantial transformation in the landscape with the creation of new villages, especially uphill villages of communities who build their own fortified granary, which is cut into the mountains. So we can really see the population moving into the mountains to be protected and saved from the danger of local tribes that were sacking and destroying the landscape. So we can really see a progressive transformation in the landscape in relation, a restoration of the landscape in relation to the olive oil production and the necessity to continue to produce olive oil despite the danger.
It's very interesting. So olive oil production continues, but the political landscape means that farms are fortified and there are these granaries and all of that. But before you tell us more about that, I'd love to know, you mentioned Redslip pottery a lot. What is Redslip African pottery and why people were so keen to have it?
So the African Redslip pottery is basically the table vessels, like we use China nowadays. In antiquities, they were using this very red colored pottery that was produced in North Africa.
And what does it look like? Is it plain or is it decorated? I mean, what makes
it?
It
can be both. Originally it's plain, but later on with the Christianization, it is decorated a lot with Christian motifs. So you can have some very elaborated plates with scenes from the Bible, or you can have crosses decorating these plates. You also have lamps made of African Redslip pottery. You have beakers and jugs. So really a full variety of vessels that you would use in your table. And outside of North Africa, it continued to be a luxury good, while in North Africa becomes a very common good because it's produced everywhere. And it's so much of value, outside of North Africa, they start imitating it. So for instance, in south of Italy, we have some production in the 6th century that imitates the African Redslip pottery. They try to make the same forms with the same colors. And also, if we move to the south of Tunisia and Libya, we see, for instance, the population of the Garamantes, who were one of these local populations who did trade with the Romans. And they started to be in contact with the Romans and to trade olive oil to the south of Africa and the East Africa. And this evidence of trading was something that they would use to mark their status in their tombs. So when we excavate these tombs of the Garamantes in the 3rd and 4th century, we see in the tombs they had a North African amphora used for olive oil and African Redslip pottery as goods in the tomb. Probably because they were traders and they were marking their status, but also because they also considered these goods as luxury goods representing their social status. And it's very interesting because these luxury goods are perceived even later, because I had the opportunity to study the pottery from the capital city of these Garamantes. And when looking at the pottery, you could see, for instance, that when the Garamantes started to trade with the Romans and receive olive oil, they changed the way in which they were cooking. So you could see the appearance of frying pan. Probably they didn't have olive oil before. And then in the 15th century, there is a very interesting marker. You see that they must have discovered these Garamantes tombs. They must have sort of seen, looted maybe, the content of these tombs. And they have seen certainly the African Redslip pottery. So they started to produce, but this time handmade imitations of the African Redslip pottery. But this is much later in the 15th century when they rediscover the Garamantes tombs.
Do you think, what happens, say, between the 3rd and the 4th centuries and the 15th century? Do you think that the pottery, that this Redslip pottery is still found? With the Arab conquest and the Islamization of the region, do you find versions of it that doesn't have Christian scenes, for example?
Well, the African Redslip pottery is, we see the last products at the end of the 7th century. So it seems that this is one of these cases in which it appears that maybe the Arab conquest brought about a substantial end to this production. But whether this is because the production was progressively diminishing, or for other reasons. It's difficult to say, but it is very likely that in the Islamic world, in the Islamic connection, exchanges, trades, pottery somehow stopped being seen as a luxury good.
I love the idea of frying pans indicating that people were cooking with olive oil and making food in a different way.
Well, it's very interesting when you can actually reconstruct the stratigraphy and look at the pottery. The pottery always tells you about the eating habits. So after the Romans, for instance, they stopped using frying pan and they started making large bowls that they hung on the fire. So you could see the handle that were made to allow them to be hung over the fire and cook. And probably they went back to boiling rather than frying. And the frying was only a kind of a moment that occurred when they were exchanging and making commercial exchange with the Romans. And so they got the olive oil. So it's very interesting. And then in the Ottoman period, with the Ottoman conquest, you see another change in the way in which the cooking is performed. This is something we never think about, but every conquest, the arrival of new people bring in new tradition and also new eating habits, a new way of approaching the everyday life.
So what did the Ottoman culinary habits do? Do you know from the pottery?
It's very similar to the previous one, but somehow this large bowl that are hung over the fire, but you start seeing the appearance of these vessels that are called the genius pot because they sort of have a face. You could see a face and a nose.
Thanks. Well, it's fascinating. Let's go back to the idea of these mountain villages and hilltops with granaries and all of that. And you told me that these still continue, some of them still survive, and that one of the things you're looking at now is the preservation of this tradition of clustering in hilltops and having shared granaries. Can you reflect and tell us a bit about that and what you're doing?
This is a project that I'm doing in the region of south of Tunisia, in the area that is called Tatawin. It's on the mountains, and in Libya, in the mountains called Nafusa. So Tatawin and Nafusa are on the border between Libya and Tunisia. In antiquity, they were the same region, and they were basically the same people. So you had these villages which were on top of the mountains and partially cut into the rock of the mountains and partially built. So they kind of intervened and made this landscape that appeared sort of hostile, approachable, and they were able to live in it. So on top you had these villages cut into the mountains with this shared granary. And the population living in these villages were traditionally called Berbers. In recent times, it's more commonly used the term Amazigh. And they have very typical architectural tradition, which is cutting the houses into the mountains and occupying basically the top of the mountains with this fortified granary, which is kind of dominating the village. And the same type of architecture of shared granary is also found at the bottom of the mountains. And there, these granaries are used by the Arabs. So you see the top of the mountains is occupied by the Amazigh, by the Berbers, and the bottom of the mountains is occupied by the Arabs. And these villages start being very visible in the landscape or attested by inscriptions from the 12th century. And they are beautiful because not only they are cut into the mountains, but they are also decorated with gypsum, with geometrical decorations, with hands which are placed on the gypsums and feet. It's all very much is related to magical traditions. These same symbols that are decorating the houses are on textile and are on the tattoos that the Berbers are wearing. So it's all related. But these villages are in danger because nobody wants to live in these villages anymore, because of course you cannot get on top of these villages by car. It's very difficult to bring electricity, to bring internet. So the people moved at the bottom of the mountains, and all these villages are progressively abandoned. For instance, in Tunisia is very famous the village of Chenini. But these villages are abandoned, and progressively also the traditions related to the life in these villages are disappearing. For instance, I was recently there and I was talking to archaeologists, and I was told that the masons were able to cut the mountain and are progressively disappearing, and there are only 3 old men left who know how to approach the mountain and how to do the cutting and how to build a house. And this is going to be a massive loss if we don't transfer this knowledge.
Do you know why they cut into the mountain in the first place? I mean, where does this tradition come from?
So I think there are many reasons, but the most obvious, I think, is the first is that these populations were living this landscape, and some somehow they had to make it livable. So they learned how to cope with an hostile landscape. Not only they built these houses cut into the rock, but also they built the roads, they built the terraces. And actually I was told when I was there that there is also a hierarchy. So when you're young and it's easier for you to walk to the top of the village, you live on top. And then as you progressively become older, you move to live at the bottom of the mountains. So, which is also very interesting how people kind of adapted to this hostile landscape. But also on the other side is the heat. I mean, in the summer, there are 55, 60 degrees in Tatawoon. And so living inside a sort of a cave provides fresh air. In fact, I just been there and there were 45 degrees. And when we were inside these houses, we went to see a woman who was producing textile in one of these houses, and it was cool.
And you told me that the textiles had very particular traditions about who wove them and how they cut them and all of that. Can you tell us a bit about these?
Yeah. Well, like these communities, they kind of, over the time, they created their own rules and their own traditions. Also, these are progressively in the verge of being lost. So we went to see this lady who makes textile. And as I said, textiles are very important because these are not just dresses. They are kind of define who you are. Because, for instance, she was explaining to me that if you are a woman who's still unmarried, you wear the red color. But if you are married, you wear the green or the blue color. You can wear some symbols and you cannot wear other symbols on your clothes. So there is a kind of a philosophy behind every aspect, every single element decorating these textiles. And as I said, the decoration on textiles are representative for groups of people. They are also decorating their houses. So it's a very anthropologically well-structured organization. And the textile is one aspect of this. So we went to see this lady who still produces these textiles in the original traditional way. And she explained to us that, for instance, there are days in which you absolutely cannot work on, you cannot weave because it's bad luck if you do. So the Wednesday, I understood, is a very bad day and you absolutely cannot do that on the Wednesday. And when you produce your textile, it has to be covered and men cannot enter in the room while you are working on your textile and they can't see how much you have produced. Also, I've noticed that on the loom, there were kind of amulets to protect the practice, this activity of making textiles. And when we visited this woman, there was also her mother, who was much older, and she said that when they were kids, they were singing songs when they were weaving because the patterns is very complicated. And so the songs were kind of helping them in remembering the patterns. But unfortunately, all these songs are lost now. Nobody has memory of these. Even the old lady couldn't remember them. And then this lady who was producing textile was also telling us that this tradition extends also to when you finish your product. You cannot cut the threads every day. It depends on how many brothers you have. So if you have like 2 brothers, you can only cut the threads on Monday. If you have 1 brother, you can cut the threads on Sunday. And then she was asking, what about if you don't have brothers? And then she said, well, then you have to count your cousins, so your male cousins. So it's very interesting because there's all this tradition behind that I'm sure has its own reason to exist. It's just more difficult for us to understand why. And then also she showed us how she worked from just the wool taken from the ships into the threads and how she made it, how she colored it. And so she said, for instance, that she makes the red color using the henna, and she made the yellow color using the dried skins of the pomegranate. And I asked her, how do you make the other colors? And she said, I go and get plants from the mountains. So I found it fascinating how people manage to kind of know their environment and take advantage of it.
Sounds fascinating. And I think it's fascinating for someone like you who's an archaeologist to be going up all the way to the modern period and looking at traditions and intangible heritage. And I wondered actually, if, to summarize and to finalize, you could tell us what your plans are. I mean, what kind of projects are you planning to do to study these traditions and hopefully preserve them?
So we want to train train them, we want to organize training sessions. So one side is maintaining the buildings. So we want these people who know how to cut the rocks and build the villages to train younger people on how to do this. So these villages can be maintained through time. We want to document as much as possible the decorations made in gypsum inside these houses and buildings. And ideally, because these villages have been abandoned and all the tools have been left inside the houses, we want to map these tools to try to reconstruct and map the buildings and to try to reconstruct how the life was inside these houses through combine these analysis with interviews to old people to see what rooms were using, for instance, for weaving, what room was used for storage. There were some rooms who had large amphoras, some rooms who had vessels who were set into the floor, probably to preserve grain. So I want to document all these because we cannot save this all. It's too much. But we want to document them using the drone. So to plan them and map them and locate them and record as much as we can inside and restore at least a few of them to provide a longer term perspective. And on the other side, we want to interview people, especially old people, about their tradition, about how to make textiles, but also how to make pottery, about histories. I'm sure there are stories about the mountains, because in the same way they managed to live in this hostile environment, they must have created stories about these mountains and how these mountains interacted with the people living in the villages. So I want to document the tangible and intangible heritage of these communities.
And do you think documenting it can help preserve some of it by raising interest in it?
Yes, one aspect is certainly to support the local groups to produce crafts, to rediscover these traditions and sell these crafts, maybe even on internet, and documenting these stories and making the local populations aware of these stories, because a lot of them don't know about this. So making them aware of the importance of their history will be the only way for them to provide a long-term maintenance and preservation of their culture. But if they are not reminded, if we don't make them aware of all these traditions, people living in modern villages do not remember about these, and they see this landscape every day. It's familiar to them, but we need to remind them of the history of what this landscape means to them to make them willing to preserve it and to maintain it through time.
It sounds like a fascinating project with so much to discover, and we wish you the best of luck. We'd love to follow what you do with it. And thank you, Anna, for such a fascinating discussion, taking us all the way from ancient times to the future of what you're doing in Tripolitania.
Well, thank you so much. And if you want to come and visit us, you're always very welcome.
Thank you.